In the early 13th century, thousands of children and adolescents left their homes and began marching across Europe, convinced that God would part the sea for them and deliver Jerusalem without a fight. They were not abducted, nor were they coerced. They were simply manipulated into doing something that our modern mind considers to be bordering on lunacy, but to them seemed normal. That is what happens when reason is hijacked to dogma and ideology, and belief is allowed unfettered access to the collective psyche. Europe in the 13th century was a society steeped in superstition, where visions were treated as proof and silence from authority was mistaken for approval. People were not acting irrationally within their world, but merely acting exactly as they had been taught to act. They trusted sermons over reality. It was a world where miracles were proof of faith, and faith justified the consequences of irrational behavior. Irrationality was not even a thing back then. That is a thoroughly modern concept. This all happened pre-Enlightenment, when the religious mindset was paramount and dictated how people thought and acted. The Children's Crusade to liberate Jerusalem was an example of medieval cultish mass delusion, which would be comical if it wasn't tragic. When children decided to launch a crusade in the name of Christ, no one in power stopped them. Clergy hesitated, and rulers looked away as if nothing was happening. Their parents deferred to God. In that vacuum, rumor and imagination fused into a self-contained belief system, and what followed went well beyond religious fervor, but disappeared into the realm of mass psychological hysteria. In the year 1212, thousands of young people, mostly adolescents, not infants, abandoned their homes and began walking across Europe. They did not believe they were fleeing danger. They believed they were answering a call and that God had chosen them, and no one with the power to stop them did anything. They didn't leave in the night like runaways. They left in daylight. They walked through villages while adults watched. They crossed town squares while bells rang in their honor. This is the Children's Crusade, not a fairy tale, not a misunderstanding, not just a moment of medieval madness. It was something far more disturbing. It was a society quietly allowing belief to replace responsibility and letting the young pay the price. The point of the Children's Crusade was not symbolic protest or pilgrimage. It was direct, targeted action. The young people who left believed they were going to liberate Jerusalem and the Holy Land from the infidels without violence, through divine intervention alone, because God was guiding them as the prima agent in all human affairs. They believed this because they had been taught that the previous crusades had failed, because God had withdrawn his favor from sinful adults. Knights were corrupt, kings were proud, and the clergy were greedy for wealth. The conclusion drawn by preachers and popular theology was simple and devastating. God no longer trusted grown men with his cause. Only the innocent could bring about salvation of the human race, and that meant liberating Jerusalem. It was a religious imperative. The children believed that they were different. Their age was not a weakness, quite the opposite. They were taught that innocence and purity carried spiritual power, that God listened more readily to the young, and that miracles followed faith, not force. In that worldview, marching without weapons was not naive. It was proof of worthiness. This was a job for children. Specifically, many believed that when they reached the Mediterranean, the sea would simply part for them, just as it had for Moses in the book of Exodus. They expected to walk through the eastern Mediterranean Sea, be welcomed into the Holy Land, and there see Jerusalem return to Christendom without bloodshed. Some versions of the belief held that Muslims would convert upon witnessing the miracle. Others believed angels would intervene directly. All assumed that God would act visibly and decisively, rewarding them for carrying out God's work. They also believed that suffering along the way was not evidence of error, but a test of their belief in the cause. Hunger, exhaustion, and death were interpreted as trials of faith rather than warnings. Endurance became a form of proof of their commitment to the mission of God. As long as the miracle lay ahead, nothing that happened on the road could disprove the mission. To understand why they left, you have to understand the world they lived in. Medieval Europe was exhausted by failure. For more than a century, Crusades had promised glory and delivered humiliation and disappointment. Jerusalem was taken, lost, taken again, lost again in rapid succession. Armies marched east with banners and relics and returned broken, bankrupt, or not at all. Every defeat demanded explanation, and medieval theology provided one that was both comforting and lethal. God was not failing. It was people who were failing God, and by people the preachers meant the adults, the parents. This explanation then hardened into a doctrine of salvation. They believed the Crusades had failed to that point because adults were sinful and the warriors were. If adults could not succeed, perhaps the pure of heart could. Perhaps those untouched by sin would be heard by God where armies had been ignored. This mindset at the time was not fringe thinking. It came from pulpits and was spread through sermons. It was repeated so often that it became an accepted truth. Children were not seen primarily as fragile. They were seen as spiritually powerful. Scripture itself had taught that God listened to the young, the humble, the meek. Childhood was associated with closeness to the divine. The message that God had chosen the young to perform divine work on earth, it did not sound absurd. It sounded plausible, even reasonable. Most of those who left their homes to embark on the crusade were typically between 10 and 18, with many in their early to mid-teens. Medieval chroniclers described them using the word pueri, a term that modern readers translate as children, but which in medieval Latin meant something broader in scope. The term pueri meant anyone from the young, the unmarried, the landless, and the dependent, all people without power more than people without age. Teenagers, adolescents, and even young adults could all be considered as children if they had no legal or economic status. These were young people old enough to understand sermons, old enough to work, old enough to walk hundreds of miles, but too young to command authority or protection. They occupied the most vulnerable position in medieval society, those with responsibility without power. Into this world stepped a boy from northern France named Stephen of Cloyes. Stephen claimed that Christ had appeared to him. Christ, he said, had handed him a letter and commanded him to preach. Stephen did what medieval culture had trained him to do. He spoke. He told others that God had bypassed kings and bishops and armies. He said that the young had been chosen where the old had failed, and people listened. His words were a spark that set off a wildfire in the popular imagination. Children listened first, then adolescents, then entire peer groups. Stephen moved from village to town, gathering followers as he went. The crowds grew quickly, not because they were forced, but because they were invited. Adults did not shut him down. Some may have mocked him, but enough believed him to help his message spread. Some even encouraged him. Almost no one stopped him. That silence mattered. In a medieval world, authority was loud when it disapproved. Silence was not neutral. Silence felt like consent. At roughly the same time, far to the east, another figure emerged. Nicholas of Cologne, probably a teenager himself, began preaching a similar message in the German lands. He too spoke of divine command and promised miracles. He too gathered thousands. Inspired, his followers began moving south over the Alps toward Italy and the sea, where a miracle awaited them, proof of the sanctity of their divine mission. But the Alps are not a symbolic terrain, nor a metaphor. They are cold and dangerous. Many died from snow, exposure, hunger, exhaustion in the crossing of the Alps. Medieval chroniclers mention these deaths almost casually, as if this was just an acceptable loss. Across Europe, the same pattern repeated. Young people left farms, workshops, and households. They left with friends, with siblings, with neighbors, a fellowship of the deluded. Once the groups formed, momentum took over. To stay behind was no longer just to doubt the miracle, it was to abandon your community. Those wavering felt a sense of obligation to leave and join the march to the sea. Nobody wanted to be left behind. Walking itself was integral to the mission. Every mile endured confirmed belief. Hunger became a test. Death became martyrdom, and safe passage to heaven and doubt became betrayal. This is how belief sustains itself long after reality has issued its warning. Poverty made departure easier. Many of these young people came from the lowest class of society, households with little land and fewer prospects. Leaving did not always feel like sacrifice. In some cases it felt like escape. On the road there was food given by charity. There was movement and meaning, and the intoxicating idea that your life mattered to God in a way ordinary existence back in your village never had. And always hovering over everything was the promise, the miracle waiting to happen. They were told that when they reached the Mediterranean, the waters would open for them just as they had for Moses. No ships would be needed, no weapons, no money, just faith. As long as that promise remained intact, everything else could be endured. The march was brutal. Disease spread, feet rotted. Some collapsed and were left behind. Some turned back, many did not. The columns thinned as walkers felt by the wayside, but they did not break. Belief carried them forward long after common sense would have stopped them. When they finally reached the Mediterranean, places like Marseille and Genoa, the moment of truth arrived. They gathered on the shoreline. They waited and they prayed and they sang, but nothing happened. The sea did not move as promised. There was no miracle, no sign, just water and the Mediterranean which stopped them from progressing. At that moment, the psychological structure holding everything together collapsed. The young people who had walked across a continent suddenly found themselves stranded, exhausted, and exposed with no moral or physical support. Their world collapsed. This is where adults re-entered the story in force. Merchants appeared, offering help. Ships were promised, and passage to the Holy Land was discussed. Some offers were real, but many were not. Chroniclers later recorded that groups of children were loaded onto ships and never seen again, sold into slavery in North Africa and the Eastern Mediterranean. The Crusade, this ended up in a terrible tragedy for many of the child pilgrims. That's what happens when people become deluded. And it a lesson for today. What matters is the pattern. When belief collapses, exploitation rushes in to fill the vacuum. Young people with no protection, no resources, and no authority become easy targets. The world that had praised their faith now turned away. There was no reckoning. No admission of failure and no apology that adults had failed conspired in the madness. Because the Church had made no official crusade proclamation, it accepted no official responsibility. The institution distanced itself with careful language, and chroniclers of the age airbrushed out the truth of the sad, sorry affair. Numbers shrank while deaths became disappearances. History was quietly rewritten. The Children's Crusade slowly faded into legend, whitewashed of its horror and padded with romance. Centuries later it became just a crazy thing those medieval people did. We in the modern world are supposed to be above such religious fundamentalism. No parent would encourage their sons and daughters to embark on such a dangerous journey or even be allowed to by social services. But the reality is harder and far more uncomfortable. These young people did not leave because they were stupid. They did not leave because they were uniquely naive. They left because their society taught them that cult trumped common sense and that silence from authority meant consent. History loves kings and great generals. It remembers victories such as Agincourt and Waterloo. It canonizes popes and commanders, but it rarely pauses over the young victims of a cult who died because adults confused belief with leadership and encouraged them to embark on a foolhardy and dangerous mission to save their souls. The Children's Crusade was not a holy march, but it was a warning. And like so many warnings in history, it was ignored. The question we must ask ourselves is not, could this sort of weird cultish behavior happen again in our time, in our society, with our so-called rational mindset. But is it already happening in another guise? Are we blind to it and in a state of denial? Please leave a comment.